Welcome back. This week we'll be talking about the PEP8 or the Python style guide. So this lets us format our code more. It gives a standard to format our code. So let's get started. So what is PEP8? Well, PEP8 stands for the Python Enhancement Proposal. So like this name suggests, it's a proposal, so it's not mandatory, but proposes certain ways to do things in your code. So certain ways to write your code to make it more readable. One of the founding principles of Python was the readability and standardization across all developers and across all platforms. So Python really stresses the fact of being readable and neat code to share with different audiences. So the Python Enhancement Proposal proposes these rules and regulations to abide by when coding. They're a proposal, like I said, they're not mandatory. So not following these conventions don't usually lead to errors. But obviously, it's a convention, so you should always, most of the times, you should follow convention in your code so that other people have easier time reading it. Or even if you go back later on to to projects you've worked on in the past, you'll be able to understand what's going on more effectively. So we want to follow the PEP8 style guide. It would just make us better programmers in Python and help us help others. So let's talk about the first rule. We'll cover a few rules in the PEP8 style guide, and that will be the entirety of this video, which is why it'll be a little short, but we just want to make sure we hit home the basic rules. So parameters and lists. When you're using lists or argument lists, elements separated by a comma, you must vertically align them with the first element on the same line. So here we have my function. Since it's crossing a certain barrier, let's say this barrier, which we'll cover later on in this presentation, the barrier is 200 characters. It's usually, I think, might be 80. I'm not exactly sure on that, but let's say there's a barrier that you want to soft wrap your code in. You want to start the next parameter line. If it's a parameter, you want to start the next line wherever the first parameter starts on the first line or the line before that. So it kind of seems a little confusing, but if you just see right here, we have var1, var2, var3, var4, var5, and var6. We want to start this new line at var1 because it's just more neater and we can see that it's part of the parameter list. Or we showed here at least one indentation level on the next line. So this is also valid Python. So all of this is valid Python. What we show in the future is valid Python, but it's also recommended Python. So also lists, if you're separating it with multiple, if you're going multiple lines, you want to start it off at the same level the first line started. Now, tabs versus spaces. So this is definitely a PEP8 rule. For new code, we only want to use spaces. So each indent, so Python is an indent-based language, right? Each indent must be 4 spaces. Yes, and most IDEs and Python also supports tabbing instead of spaces, but the PEP8 style guide suggests using spaces. And also, they suggest using either tabs or spaces. So if you use tabs in your code, you don't want to switch to spaces randomly in the middle. And also if you're using spaces in your code, you don't want to switch randomly to tabs. But the complete recommendation is to just use 4 spaces for tabs. So if you have a double tab, it would be 8 spaces and so on. So again, like I said, for code already written with tabs, keep it consistent. So that's also a PEP8 recommendation. Keep your code consistent. You don't want to switch tabs with 4 spaces with tabs, and so on. Just keep either tabs or spaces, but they recommend using spaces. Let's talk about line length. So this was the size I talked about before. So yes, I was close. Lines are limited to a length of 79 characters. So not 80, but 79 characters. And if you have a comment, it's 72, because comments are usually indented. or at least comments, if they're on a separate line of themselves, they want to go to 72 characters long. So if you look at the picture, we have var hello world. Obviously this is not 79 characters long, but we just showed because we don't want to have a sentence with, or we don't want to have a line of code that's 72 characters long because that would take too much space in the presentation. But here, let's say hello world and we had other characters that ended with 79. We would want to add it to the next line. So the way we can do that for strings, we can just do string concatenation and put it on the next line. So this doesn't really change the actual value of the string. It just makes it easier reading the code in Python. So lines can be broken before or after the operator. You can see var1, the lines are broken after the operator, and var2, the lines are broken before the operator. So that's not a PEP8 specific recommendation. Yep. Okay, blank lines. This is also one of the most important, I wouldn't say most important, but one of the most frequent PEP8 style guide issues you might come across it in Python, especially if you're coding in an IDE that points out PEP8 style guides. You might see this yellow underline, or sometimes they wouldn't highlight it red, but it's yellow because it's a warning. It's not really going to affect your code, but it's a yellow underline usually that tells you have too many spaces or too many blank lines. So this is one of the most common PEP8 issues. And the idea is you usually want to have 2 blank lines between any function in your code. And this is function not within a class. So these are functions at the global scope. So if you have functions defined at the global scope, multiple of them, you want to split them up and give 2 blank spaces between them. And this just makes it, once again, easier to read your code later on. You don't want to look at too many things at once or at the same time. So 2 spaces is the value they chose, the people who created the Python style guide. If you have a method in a class, although, you have to, you usually have to space it off 1 blank line. So as you can see here, we did have 2 blank lines at the top before the init method, but that's not necessary. But between methods in a class, you want to have 1 space. So you can see between the constructors and method, and between this add method, we have 1 blank line, and the same thing for the add and subtract. So those are in classes, you want to have 1 blank line. Because if you think about it, if you have a class, you want to keep it at least condensed, or you want to be able to see what's going on in the class. So 2 blank lines might make it too spread out, and that's not the most effective way. And also classes might have multiple different methods, so having 2 blank lines could make your code really, really long, the length. And like I said, blank lines can be used to separate related functions. So if we have multiple different types of functions or functions that do the same thing, we can separate them off by blank lines. Once again, these are not set rules where you have to follow them. It's up to essentially the programmer in the end to what rules they want to follow, what rules they don't want to follow, what rules they might think is easier to work with. It just depends on the scenario and context. But PEP8 gives a suggestion. Okay, let's talk about imports. Now, the Python style guide covers almost all different kind of niche areas of Python. So it also talks about import statements. If you're importing 2 packages, in this case we're importing the random and the OS modules. If you're importing these 2 modules separately, we want, and they're not really related, we want to separate them on separate lines. So I said separate a lot, but we have import random and import OS. That's the most recommended way of importing these 2 modules. We don't want to do import random comma OS, although that is supported in Python. That's completely valid Python code. This won't throw an error. You want to kind of get away from that and stick with import random and import OS. And once again, if you think about it, this kind of shows that these are two separate modules, they do different things. And inputting on the same line kind of gives some kind of relation, and if they don't have a relation, that could be hard to understand for for other programmers. So if you see, imports should usually be at the top of the file. That's also one of the most important parts. If you try importing a package in the middle of your file and you use it later on, yes, that would work, but your IDE will also show you that you should put all imports at the top of your file. So once again, if you're importing separate modules or packages, you want to have them on separate lines. But if you're importing parts of a library, which is supported in Python using the form from library import module or from package import module, yes, you could do that. And that could be in the same line. So from random import shuffle rand int, you don't want to do import random dot shuffle or anything like that. That wouldn't really be the best. So from random import shuffle rand int, and that's the most accepted or widely used Python style for importing specific modules from packages. Okay, let's talk about single quotes versus double quotes. Now, it's probably widely known that Python supports both single quotes and double quotes for strings, but Python prefers single quotes. So if you have quotes within quotes, don't use the backslash. So preferably, so if you see variable 2, we have hello. The word hello is a greeting. You don't want to put backslash quotes inside of that quote. You would rather put single quotes on the outside and then double quotes on the inside. So that is important. So here we kind of switched it. In variable 1, we put double quotes on the outside and single quotes. But if you wanted double quotes on the inside, you would put double quotes on the inside and single quotes on the outside. And also, Python in general supports or recommends single quotes for basic string literals. And that's just, again, a recommendation and a suggestion. So I'll repeat this. If you're trying to use both double quotes and single quotes inside your string, if you're using, let's say, double quotes in your string, you would wrap your entire string in single quotes. If you're using single quotes in your string, you would wrap your entire string with double quotes. So just to keep it more neat, instead of using backslash quote, which is kind of messy if you think about it. Okay, spaces between symbols. So these are like very nitpicky rules and guides, but they exist and they just do it for to help the programmer. So we want to add a space on either side of an operator. So if you see print 10 plus 5, we see 10 space plus place 5. We don't want to do print space 10 space plus space 5 space. That's not really recommended because it doesn't look the best. Print 10 plus 5, that is sometimes acceptable, and you won't really see your IDE complaining about it. But the PEP8 suggests that we do add this space between 10 and 5. So it just looks much better. And then obviously the last one is also not acceptable because it doesn't look the best. So a lot of rules concerning the PEP8 style guide would be because of the looks, because we want to make it more readable and consistent. You do not want to have a space before any parentheses when you're calling a method or a function. So here we're calling the print function. We don't want to do print space and then put the parentheses and then put whatever value or arguments we need to put. We want to have the parentheses right next to the function name when we call it. And also differentiate spaces for priority. So we have 10 plus 2 times 13 plus 15. We would want to do 10 plus 2 times 13 plus 15 with 2 times 13 closer. So we don't have to, but that kind of shows that 2 times 13 will be performed first, even though we know that already because of order of operations. It kind of shows this visually when we're coding in Python. So those are just nitpicky rules, but if we follow it, once you get used to this, you won't really have to think about it whenever you're coding. You'll just know that if you don't do it, it'll be wrong. It's wrong in your head. So don't worry if you think this is too much to think about when you're coding in Python. if you just start coding and try following these, eventually it's just going to be habit, and you're just going to get familiar with this type of style guide. Naming conventions. So most people know that Python uses something called snake case. So yes, it is coincidence, snake case, Python, snake, but variables, functions, and methods being methods are in classes and functions just in general, should all use snake case. So everything lowercase, and we want to split words, different words with underscore. So usually many languages use something called camel case, and actually in Python we do use camel cases in a certain scenario, but let's like Java, we would start with a lowercase word, and then every other word will be exactly next to the next word, but capitalized, as the first letter capitalized. So that's camel case, representing the humps of a camel. But snake case is what we use in Python when we're talking about variables, functions, and methods. For classes, on the other hand, we want to use camel case. So yes, we're using two different types of cases in Python, but it just looks much neater when we use camel case for classes, because it kind of gives the utmost priority and utmost level of power to a certain kind of structure. So variables like integers, if we have an int variable, if we have a string variable, yes, those are pretty powerful, but the level of importance is not as much when we're talking about classes. So we want to use camel case, and actually it's kind of camel case, it's kind of not. We just want to capitalize everything. So even the first word, the first letter of the first word must be capitalized. We don't want to start off with a lowercase word and then capitalize every other one. We want to start off with all capitalized. So every letter of every word, every first letter of every word should be capitalized. So similar to camel case, but not exactly camel case. So the naming conventions aren't as clear as other conventions. Like in Java, you might have certain conventions of naming, but we want to keep names short but relevant. So this is kind of like a given when you're talking about programming in almost any language. You want to keep it relevant. You want to know what you're accessing when you call a variable. But also you want to keep it short. You don't want to call an extremely long variable if you don't need to, because that just wastes time, and it's hard to understand where that variable is coming from, where you declared it, initialized it, and so on. So variable names should be short and relevant. Constants should be all caps. So this is a convention. If we have a constant, and we don't define constants, we're talking about just variables that are not intended to change later on, should be all caps. So if you're dealing with let's say networking in Python, and you have certain constants like your server IP and so on, you would put them in all caps, because we want to say this is not intended to change. So if you any kind of scenario you're coding in Python, you want to have something that doesn't change, you would specify that using all caps. So that doesn't really tell Python that it's not going to change. It could still change in the future, but the convention of constants is all caps. And the final naming convention is the self keyword. So we talked about the self keyword, and that was kind of misleading. It's not really a keyword as to say that it is just a variable. So the convention is to use self, because you're talking about yourself, or the self of the object, right? The object itself. But we could basically name it any other valid variable name. So we could say it's this. So if you're coming from like something like Java, we could specify that that's called this, and then whenever you call it later on in your functions, you would specify this instead of self. So this is the conventions of using naming in Python. PEP8 is much more vast than what we covered. We just covered naming conventions, spaces, tabs, quotes, imports, and blank lines, and so on. PEP8 has a lot more of these rules, and I would suggest personally that it's not extremely important to follow every single rule. Actually, that probably wouldn't be as recommended, because you'll be thinking about too many things as you code. Only follow the rules that are the most basic, or try to follow the rules that are most basic, that let you share your code most effectively. So other people should be able to read your code and immediately know what's going on, or at least with some explanation. And there shouldn't be really confusion regarding the syntax or semantics in your code. So that's the entire idea of Python, and following the PEP8 style guide, the Python enhancement proposal, will only get you one step closer to achieving that effective sharing of your code, and different audiences will be able to understand. So that was the review of PEP8. We'll see you next week.